During the 2003-04 NHL season, the Vancouver Canucks and Colorado Avalanche were fierce Northwest Division rivals, both vying for playoff positioning. Their games were intense and physical, but tensions truly ignited on February 16, 2004, in Denver. In that game, Colorado rookie Steve Moore delivered a hard, open ice hit on Canucks captain Marcus Nestlund, who was the NHL's leading scorer at the time. Nestlund suffered a minor concussion and a chipped elbow bone, causing him to miss 3 games. No penalty was called on Moore's hit. The referees deemed it legal, which infuriated the Canucks. Vancouver's coach Mark Crawford lashed out at the officials for failing to protect his star player, calling the hit a cheap shot and questioning the respect shown to a league scoring leader. Canucks GM Brian Burke, formerly the NHL's disciplinarian, publicly criticized Moore as a marginal player going after a superstar with a headhunting hit. The Canucks locker room was livid. Veteran Trevor Linden called it a blatant attempt by a marginal player to hurt our guy, and forward Brad May even remarked about placing a bounty on Moore as retribution. In response, Moore maintained that he had simply finished his check and hadn't intended to injure Nestlund. The bad blood was now simmering between the teams. They met again on March 3, 2004. That game remained uneventful and ended in a 5-5 tie. Despite the public war of words cooling for the moment, everyone knew the issue was not truly settled, setting the stage for their next matchup in Vancouver. Todd Bertuzzi, a 6'3", 245-pound power forward, Bertuzzi was an established star for the Canucks by 2003-04. Drafted 23rd overall by the New York Islanders in 1993, he joined Vancouver via trade in 1998 and blossomed into one of the league's top forwards. In the 2002-03 season, Bertuzzi hit career highs with 46 goals, 51 assists, and 97 points, finishing among the NHL's scoring leaders. He earned first-team All-Star honors in 2003 and appeared in the NHL All-Star Game in 2003 and 2004. As part of the Canucks' famed West Coast Express line with Marcus Nestlund and Brendan Morrison, Bertuzzi's role was to combine skill and physicality. He could score highlight reel goals and intimidate opponents with his size. By 2004, he was an alternate captain and team leader known for his edgy play and offensive prowess. However, he also had a mean streak, and his imposing style sometimes crossed the line, resulting in a few prior suspensions, though nothing like what was to come. Steve Moore. In stark contrast to Bertuzzi, Steve Moore was a relatively obscure player prior to the incident. A Toronto-born forward and Harvard University graduate, Moore was drafted 53rd overall by Colorado in 1998. He spent several years developing in college and the minors before cracking the Avalanche lineup. The 2003-04 season was the 25-year-old Moore's first extended stint in the NHL, and he played a fourth-line checking role. In fact, he was a rookie on a Colorado roster filled with future Hall of Famers like Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, Rob Blake, Paul Kariya, and Timo Salan. Moore's stats were modest. By early March 2004, he had 5 goals and 7 assists in 57 games, but he was proving himself as a hard-working, defensively reliable forward. He had little name recognition around the league until the Nestlund hit thrust him into the spotlight as an unlikely villain. Teammates and coaches considered Moore a smart, dedicated player trying to stick in the NHL, not an enforcer or goon by trade. Nonetheless, his hit on Nestlund made him the target of Vancouver's anger heading into that fateful March 8th game. The game in question took place on March 8th, 2004 at Vancouver's General Motors Place, and it was a late-season regular season contest with high stakes. The Canucks and Avalanche were neck and neck in the standings. From the outset, however, the storyline was less about points and more about payback. The atmosphere was tense, and the building was sold out with 18,630 fans in attendance, many anticipating some response to the Nestlund-Moore incident. Early in the game, the pent-up hostility erupted into multiple fights. In fact, there were 4 separate fights in the first period alone. At 6:36 of the first period, Steve Moore was challenged by Canucks forward Matt Cook, and the two dropped the gloves. Moore held his own in the fight, effectively answering the bell for his hit on Nestlund. By the unwritten code of hockey, that bout should have settled the score, and for a while, it seemed it had. But the game had a life of its own. Colorado exploded to an early lead, scoring 5 unanswered goals by the end of the first period. Ironically, Moore himself scored a goal, the 5th of the night for Colorado, and his 5th of the season during this offensive outburst. As the second period went on, the Avalanche lead grew, and frustrations mounted for Vancouver. By midway through the third period, Colorado was leading 8-2. The outcome all but decided. The combination of the lopsided score and the lingering grudge made the situation volatile. The NHL's front office was so concerned that during the first intermission, with the score already 5-0, league officials Colin Campbell and Andy Van Hellemond phoned the arena to warn the on-ice referees to watch for escalating violence. Everyone sensed that despite Moore's earlier fight, certain players and fans still felt Moore hadn't truly paid for injuring Nesland. This powder keg was about to ignite. The long-brewing hostility culminated in one of hockey's ugliest moments. Canucks winger Todd Bertuzzi jumped over the boards with a clear agenda and zeroed in on Steve Moore. Shift after shift, Bertuzzi shadowed Moore, verbally taunting him and trying to goad him into another fight. Moore, following his coach's advice, refused to engage and skated away each time. Finally, in open ice near center ice, Bertuzzi made his move. He skated up behind the unsuspecting Moore, grabbed the back of Moore's jersey with his left hand, and sucker punched Moore in the side of the head from behind with his right fist. The punch, thrown by the 245-pound Bertuzzi, immediately knocked Moore out cold, and his limp body crashed face-first to the ice with Bertuzzi falling on top of him. In the chaotic seconds that followed, two Avalanche players, including forward Andrei Nicolishin, jumped in to pull Bertuzzi off, and several Canucks players also piled onto the dog pile. Bertuzzi continued throwing punches even as Moore lay motionless, until Nicolishin physically restrained Bertuzzi's arms. A full-line brawl erupted around them, with all remaining players on the ice pairing off, while Moore remained down on the ice. Many Vancouver fans initially cheered, thinking Bertuzzi had given Moore a deserved comeuppance. However, as it became clear that Moore was seriously injured, he wasn't moving, and a pool of blood was visible on the ice, the crowd's mood turned to shock and eerily fell silent. The GM Place Arena, moments earlier boisterous, now watched in horror as trainers and medical staff rushed out to tend to Moore. For 10 minutes, Steve Moore lay motionless where he fell while paramedics stabilized him. The atmosphere was somber and tense. Even players on both teams looked on with concern. Eventually, Moore was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, his neck in a brace, and wheeled off the ice to a standing ovation from the worried crowd. In the aftermath of the attack, Colorado's coach Tony Granato furiously demanded an end to the game then and there. Avalanche GM Pierre Lacroix even asked the officials to call the game off with time still on the clock. The referees did consider it, but ultimately decided to play out the remaining minutes, which passed without incident. The final score was 9-2 in favor of Colorado, but the scoreboard was irrelevant. The night would be forever remembered for Bertuzzi's brutal hit on Moore. Moore's injuries were catastrophic. The combination of the sucker punch, the impact of hitting the ice face first, and the pile-on resulted in 3 fractured vertebrae in his neck, serious facial lacerations, and a severe grade 3 concussion. He sustained damage to neck ligaments and nerves, and even experienced brief amnesia from the concussion. Moore was hospitalized in Vancouver and later moved to a Denver hospital for specialized care. These injuries ended Steve Moore's professional hockey career at just 25 years old. He never played another NHL game after that night. Moore faced a long rehabilitation, but he never fully recovered to a point where he could return to pro hockey. The image of him lying bloodied and motionless on the ice became a grim symbol of the dangers of on-ice violence. In the 2 days immediately after the incident, a shaken Bertuzzi held a press conference where he tearfully apologized to Moore, Moore's family, and everyone involved.
Comments for Steve. Steve, I just want to apologize for what happened out there. That I had no intention on hurting you. That I feel awful for what transpired. Steve's family. Sorry that you had to go through this. And I'm sorry about, again, what happened out there.
Despite the apology, Bertuzzi's name was tarnished, and he would live under the shadow of this incident for the rest of his career. The NHL acted swiftly and decisively in punishing Todd Bertuzzi. He was assessed a match penalty automatic ejection that night and suspended indefinitely the next day, pending a disciplinary hearing. On March 11, 2004, after meeting with Bertuzzi and Canucks management, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman announced Bertuzzi would be suspended for the remainder of the season and playoffs. This ended Bertuzzi's 2003-04 season immediately, a total ban of 13 regular season games plus 7 playoff games. It was one of the longest suspensions in NHL history at the time. In terms of games missed due to suspension, it ranked as the 4th longest ever, and due to the league's 2004-05 lockout, it kept Bertuzzi out of NHL action for 17 months. The suspension cost Bertuzzi over $500,000 in lost salary and an estimated $350,000 in lost endorsements. The Canucks organization was also fined $250,000 by the league. The NHL made it clear that Bertuzzi's attack was intolerable. Additionally, the IIHF International Ice Hockey Federation upheld the NHL's suspension, banning Bertuzzi from playing in any European or international leagues during the NHL lockout in 2004 to 2005. Many NHL players had gone to play in Europe during that labor stoppage, but Bertuzzi was not allowed to. He also was kept off Canada's national team for the 2004 World Cup and 2005 World Championships due to the international ban. It wasn't until August 2005, just before the 2005-06 season, that Bettman reinstated Bertuzzi, stating that the player had paid a very significant price for his conduct and was remorseful. The Bertuzzi-Moore incident did not just trigger league discipline, it also became a criminal and civil matter. Vancouver police opened an investigation the night of the attack, treating it as an assault on the ice. In June 2004, after a 4-month investigation, the British Columbia Prosecution Service charged Todd Bertuzzi with assault causing bodily harm, a criminal offense. Bertuzzi ultimately pleaded guilty in court in December 2004 to the assault charge as part of a plea bargain. His sentence was a conditional discharge, no jail time, but 1 year of probation and 80 hours of community service. He was also forbidden to play in any game that Steve Moore was playing in during that probation period. Because he met the conditions of his sentence, Bertuzzi avoided a criminal record under Canadian law. Steve Moore, for his part, pursued civil action to seek damages for the career-ending injuries he suffered. In 2005, Moore filed a lawsuit in Colorado against Bertuzzi and the Canucks organization, including Mark Crawford and Brad May, who had made the bounty comment. That suit was dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, with the U.S. court suggesting it be refiled in Canada. Moore then filed a $19.5 million lawsuit in Ontario in 2006 against Bertuzzi, and the Canucks Ontario was chosen in part because Moore's family was based in Ontario. He sought 15 million Canadian dollars for lost income, plus additional damages for pain and suffering, and his parents even filed claims for emotional distress. The civil case dragged on for years, with slow progress and no trial as both sides gathered evidence. It wasn't until August 2014, a full decade later, that the civil lawsuit was finally resolved with an out-of-court settlement. The terms of the settlement were confidential, but it brought an end to the long legal battle. By then, Moore had been long retired from hockey, and Bertuzzi was nearing the end of his NHL career. Steve Moore's NHL career was tragically cut short. Prior to the incident, he had played 69 career NHL games, all with Colorado, and he would never add to that total. The injuries he suffered on March 8, 2004 effectively ended his playing days. Moore was unable to fully recover to competitive shape. He attempted rehab and even some skating in the years after, but doctors never cleared him to return to professional hockey. He officially retired and later focused on his health and other pursuits, including starting a foundation for brain injury recovery. Todd Bertuzzi, meanwhile, was allowed to resume his career in 2005. He returned to the Canucks for the 2005-06 season, once his suspension was lifted and actually produced a respectable 71-point season that year. However, the incident clearly left a mark on him, both in reputation and performance. Bertuzzi was traded away from Vancouver in 2006 and became something of an NHL journeyman, playing for the Florida Panthers, Anaheim Ducks, Calgary Flames, and Detroit Red Wings in subsequent years. While he had some productive moments, he never regained the dominant form he had prior to the incident. Before the suspension, he was a two-time All-Star power forward at his peak. Afterward, he was largely a secondary player. He finished his career in 2014 with solid cumulative stats, 770 points over 1,159 games, but the shadow of the Moore incident followed him everywhere. In visiting arenas, especially in Colorado, Bertuzzi was routinely booed and labeled a villain for what he had done. The incident likely cost Bertuzzi any shot at Hall of Fame consideration and became the defining moment of his career. In the 1996-97 NHL season, the Detroit Red Wings were a powerhouse team determined to end a decades-long championship drought. Led by legendary coach Scotty Bowman and captain Steve Yzerman, the Red Wings roster was stacked with talent. Stars like Sergei Fedorov, Brendan Shanahan, and Nicholas Lidstrom headlined the offense and defense, and the team also featured the famed Russian 5 unit, consisting of Igor Larionov, Slava Kozlov, Sergei Fedorov, and defensemen Vyacheslav Fetisov and Vladimir Konstantinov. This deep collection of veteran leaders and skilled players had come close to a title in prior years, and in 1997, they finally broke through. Detroit finished with a 38-26-18 record, earning 94 points, and entered the playoffs as a top contender. In the postseason, they defeated St. Louis, Anaheim, and their rival Colorado Avalanche, advancing to the Stanley Cup Finals for a chance to win their first championship since 1955. The Red Wings faced the Philadelphia Flyers in the 1997 Stanley Cup Finals. In a dominant performance, Detroit swept the Flyers 4-0 in the best-of-7 series. This victory secured the franchise's first Stanley Cup in 42 years, ending the long wait since their 1954-55 title. The triumph was capped off by gritty performances from role players, including Darren McCarty, who scored a famous highlight reel goal in Game 4, and steady goaltending by Mike Vernon, who was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. The championship triggered euphoric celebrations in Detroit, a city nicknamed Hockey Town, with a downtown victory parade and the team basking in the adulation of fans after finally reclaiming hockey's greatest prize. Notably, Vladimir Konstantinov and Slava Fetisov were key members of that championship team. Konstantinov was an elite defenseman known for his fearless physical play and defensive skill. He had even been a finalist for the Norris Trophy, awarded to the NHL's best defenseman in 1997. Fetisov, 39, was a highly accomplished veteran, a former Soviet legend, and Hockey Hall of Famer who provided leadership on Detroit's blue line. Both men were integral to the Red Wings' success. Tragically, just 6 days after hoisting the Stanley Cup, the team was struck by misfortune when a limousine carrying several members of the Red Wings organization crashed, turning the joyous mood in Detroit to shock and concern. On the night of June 13, 1997, less than a week after the championship win, a horrific limousine accident forever altered the lives of those involved. Earlier that day, the Red Wings had held a golf outing and team party as a final celebration before players parted ways for the offseason. That evening, a white stretch Lincoln Town Car limo was transporting defensemen Vladimir Konstantinov and Slava Fetisov, along with the team's massage therapist Sergei Manatsakhanov, back from the event. As the limousine traveled northbound on Woodward Avenue in Birmingham, Michigan, a Detroit suburb, it suddenly went out of control at around 9:15 to 9:30 p.m. According to police and witness reports, the large limo veered off the roadway at high speed. It crossed several lanes of traffic, jumped the curb of the divided road's median, and slammed into a tree on the median. The impact was devastating. The front end of the vehicle was crumpled by the collision. Both front airbags deployed, and the force of the crash was so severe that an adjacent tree was uprooted. The crash was a single vehicle accident, as no other car was struck, and initial investigations pointed to driver error as the cause. In fact, the driver later admitted he had fallen asleep at the wheel while driving. The joyous celebrations of a week before had quickly turned into a night of chaos and fear. Inside the limousine were 4 occupants. Their conditions in the aftermath of the crash ranged from serious to critical. The Red Wings defenseman, Vladimir Konstantinov, suffered the most severe injuries. He was found unconscious at the scene and had sustained a critical head injury. Upon arrival at William Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, Konstantinov was in a coma and placed on a ventilator to keep him breathing. Doctors listed him in critical condition with serious traumatic brain injuries. His prognosis was uncertain as he fought for his life in the intensive care unit. Sergei Mnatsakhanov, the team's masseur, also suffered life-threatening injuries. He underwent emergency surgery for a compressed skull fracture, indicating severe head trauma. Mnatsakhanov was likewise in critical condition following the crash, and doctors struggled to relieve pressure on his brain. Like Konstantinov, he was hanging on to life and faced the possibility of permanent brain damage or worse. Vyacheslav Fedosov, the veteran defenseman, was injured as well, though far less gravely. Fedosov suffered chest injuries, including a bruised lung, and was admitted in fair condition at the hospital. He was conscious and even able to talk to doctors, a hopeful sign. Fedosov's injuries, while painful, ribs and lung, were not life-threatening. He was expected to recover fully after medical treatment and rest. The limousine's driver sustained injuries from the crash and was hospitalized in fair condition. Gnita's wounds were not critical, as reports indicated he was shaken and had minor injuries. However, authorities quickly discovered disturbing details about Gnita. He was driving with a suspended, revoked license and had a long history of traffic violations, including multiple alcohol-related offenses. In fact, Michigan state records showed Gnita's driver's license had been revoked since 1996 due to drunk driving convictions, meaning he should not have been behind the wheel at all. The days following the crash were tenuous. Vladimir Konstantinov remained in a coma for several weeks as doctors monitored his brain swelling and vital signs. He had suffered severe traumatic brain injury, leaving him with major cognitive and motor impairments. Remarkably, Konstantinov survived the initial critical period, but the damage to his brain was life-altering. He would eventually awaken from the coma, but he never fully recovered his former abilities. The once ferocious defenseman was left with permanent neurological deficits. He required a wheelchair for mobility and extensive long-term care. Konstantinov would never play hockey again, as his NHL career was tragically cut short at age 30. Sergei Mnatsakhanov, the team masseur, also faced a grueling recovery. His head and spinal injuries left him paralyzed from the waist down. Mnatsakhanov spent months in hospitals and rehabilitation centers. Although he eventually emerged from critical condition, he suffered partial paralysis and cognitive impairments. Like Konstantinov, Mnatsakhanov would require long-term care and use of a wheelchair. His quality of life was forever changed, a heartbreaking outcome for someone who had been celebrating alongside the team only days before. Mnatsakhanov lived as a paraplegic for many years after the crash. He passed away in 2022 at age 71. On a more hopeful note, Slava Fedosov's injuries healed relatively quickly. The bruised lung and chest trauma sidelined him for part of the summer, but he recovered and was able to resume normal activities within a few weeks. By the fall of 1997, Fedosov was healthy enough to rejoin the team for training camp. In a testament to his resilience, the veteran defenseman returned to game action in the 1997-98 season. His presence in the lineup provided an emotional lift to the club and a direct link to his injured comrades. Fedosov, already one of hockey's elder statesmen, became an even more inspirational figure as he played on that season at age 40, carrying the memory of the crash with him. Tim Horton was born on January 12, 1930, in Cochrane, Ontario, Canada. He grew up playing hockey and was signed by the Toronto Maple Leafs organization as a teenager, moving to Toronto to play junior hockey at St. Michael's College School. Horton made his NHL debut in 1949 and secured a regular spot with the Maple Leafs by the early 1950s. A durable and physical defenseman, he became known for his strength. Detroit legend Gordie Howe once called Horton the strongest guy in hockey. Horton overcame serious injuries in 1955, including a broken jaw and leg, but returned to form, eventually setting a team record by playing 486 consecutive games from 1961 to 1968. During 18 seasons in Toronto, Horton was a cornerstone of a Maple Leafs dynasty. He helped the team capture 4 Stanley Cup championships in 1962, 1963, 1964, and 1967, and was selected to multiple NHL All-Star teams. By the late 1960s, as the Leafs declined, Horton's tenure in Toronto ended. He was traded in 1970 and had brief stints with the New York Rangers and Pittsburgh Penguins. In 1972, at age 42, he joined the Buffalo Sabres, where his veteran leadership helped the young franchise reach the playoffs for the first time. Despite his age, Horton was named the Sabres MVP for the 1972 to 1973 season, proving he could still compete at a high level. By 1973, Horton had played 24 seasons in the NHL and tallied 518 career points as a defenseman. Off the ice, Tim Horton embarked on business ventures that would cement his legacy in Canadian culture. His first foray into the food industry was a hamburger restaurant in North Bay, Ontario, but it was short-lived. Horton soon shifted focus to coffee and donuts. On May 17, 1964, he opened the first Tim Horton donut shop in Hamilton, Ontario. The small storefront at 64 Ottawa Street North sold coffee and donuts for 10 cents each in its early days. Horton quickly found a partner in Ron Joyce, a former police officer who took over managing the original store in 1965. By 1967, after opening a couple more outlets, Horton and Joyce became full business partners, and the franchise was growing rapidly. Horton's name became the brand for the expanding chain. Tim Hortons had 40 stores across Canada. Horton's personal involvement included lending his name, contributing recipes such as his famous apple fritter and Dutchie donuts, and promoting the brand while still playing hockey. He dabbled in other businesses as well, at one point owning a Studebaker auto dealership and a restaurant called Tim Hortons Drive-In. But the donut shops were by far his greatest success. Horton's entrepreneurial spirit meant that by the early 1970s, he was juggling his hockey career with overseeing a budding food empire. By 1973 to 74, Horton was 44 years old and one of the oldest active players in the NHL. He had initially planned to retire, but Sabres coach Punch Imlach persuaded him to return for one more season with an enticing offer, a $150,000 salary, and a brand new De Tomaso Pantera sports car as a signing bonus. Horton, an avid car enthusiast, gladly accepted the Italian-made Pantera and frequently drove the flashy white vehicle between Buffalo and his home near Toronto. Teammates knew Horton loved driving the Pantera aggressively and fast, and Horton half-jokingly referred to it as the cursed car in conversations with friends. On February 20th, 1974, the Sabres were in Toronto to face Horton's former team, the Maple Leafs. Horton was eager to play in front of his hometown crowd and family despite having taken a puck to the jaw in practice the day before. His face was swollen and painful, but he suited up for the game. By the third period, however, the pain became too intense and Horton left the game early. The Sabres ultimately lost 4-2, and Horton was dejected, feeling he had let the team down by not finishing the game. After the game, instead of taking the team bus back to Buffalo, Horton decided to drive himself in his Pantera. Following the game at Maple Leaf Gardens, Horton met with his business partner, Ron Joyce, at the Tim Donut Lantern office in Oakville, just west of Toronto. Horton arrived with an ice pack on his injured jaw, still wearing his coat and even his driving gloves, and poured himself a vodka and soda while the two talked business. Joyce later recalled finding Horton sitting in the dark with a drink in hand, trying to numb the pain in his face. Around 3 a.m. on February 21st, Horton phoned his wife, Lori, and then his brother, Jerry. During the call, Jerry Horton realized Tim had been drinking and pleaded with him to stay overnight rather than drive. Lori Horton also had misgivings about him traveling so late. Horton insisted he was fine and decided to continue his journey. There were conflicting reports about whether he intended to stay at Ron Joyce's home in nearby Burlington or drive all the way back to Buffalo, but ultimately Horton got behind the wheel to head toward Buffalo in the early morning hours. Horton departed Oakville in his Pantera sometime after 3 a.m., headed west on the Queen Elizabeth Way highway. He reportedly took some painkillers, a handful of pills, according to Joyce, before setting off. Not long after, other motorists noticed the Pantera flying down the highway at alarming speeds. Later estimates put Horton's speed at about 110 miles per hour. At approximately 4:30 a.m., a driver near Burlington alerted the Ontario Provincial Police about a sports car driving dangerously fast on the QEW. An OPP officer, Constable Mike Gula, spotted the white sports car and attempted to follow, but Horton's high-performance Pantera easily outdistanced the police cruiser. "I saw him go by and took off after him, but I never caught him," Constable Gula recounted. "I was doing over 100 miles per hour, but I lost sight. I never got close. A few minutes later, I came upon the accident scene." Horton likely did not even realize a police car was trying to catch up to him, and there was no active chase at the moment he crashed. Horton's car apparently blew past the police cruiser and moments later went out of control near the Toronto Street exit in St. Catharines. The Pantera veered into the highway's center grass median, where a front tire struck a recessed sewer catch basin. The impact caused the car to flip end over end several times before coming to rest upside down in the opposite Toronto-bound lanes. The wreck was horrific. The sports car was completely demolished, its front end and chassis mangled beyond recognition. Horton, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was ejected from the vehicle with enormous force. He was found lying in the grass median about 37 meters, 123 feet from the car's final resting point. Constable Gula arrived at the scene minutes after the crash to find debris strewn across the highway. He discovered Horton critically injured and unresponsive in the median. Horton was still wearing the dress clothes he had left the arena in, a brown top coat over a yellow sport jacket and shirt, with brown pants and boots, now torn and bloodied from the accident. An ambulance rushed Horton to St. Catharines General Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival at approximately 4:50 a.m. He was 44 years old. The single-vehicle accident had instantly cut short the life of one of hockey's most respected veterans. News of Horton's death spread later that morning, stunning the sports world. In the immediate aftermath, however, details of the crash were somewhat shrouded. There was no official public inquiry into the accident, and initially, the full autopsy report was not released to the public. At the time, police would not comment on whether alcohol or other factors were involved. Hospital officials in 1974 stated that Horton's death was the result of injuries from the crash alone, and they claimed no contributing factors were at issue, thus no coroner's inquest was deemed necessary. It is widely believed that, in deference to Horton's reputation, authorities downplayed any suggestion of impairment immediately after the accident. Decades later, the truth emerged. In 2005, 31 years after the crash, Horton's autopsy report was made public for the first time after a Freedom of Information request by the Ottawa Citizen newspaper. The report confirmed what had long been rumored. Tim Horton was driving under the influence and had drugs in his system. Key findings from the autopsy and police investigation included Horton's blood alcohol concentration was found to be twice the legal limit at the time of the crash. A broken bottle of Smirnoff vodka was recovered among the crash debris, indicating he had been consuming alcohol during the night. Investigators found prescription pills on Horton's person, specifically 5 tablets of Dexamyl, a stimulant and sedative combo, and 2 pills of dexedrine. A stimulant were in his pockets at the crash scene. Toxicology tests revealed trace amounts of amobarbital, a barbiturate component of Dexamyl, in his bloodstream. These findings suggest Horton had taken amphetamines, likely to counter fatigue for the long drive, on top of consuming alcohol. Notably, the autopsy found no painkillers in his system, which contradicted speculation that he might have been on analgesics for his injured jaw. A mechanical examination of the wrecked Pantera determined that the car was in good working order. There was no evidence of brake failure or mechanical malfunction contributing to the crash. The cause of the accident was thus attributed to driver loss of control at high speed, rather than any defect in the vehicle. Horton's body was returned to Toronto, where he was interred at York Cemetery. The delayed release of the autopsy in 2005 publicly confirmed Horton's intoxication, a fact that had been kept quiet in 1974 to to preserve his image. While the revelations showed Horton's tragic lapse in judgment, they did little to diminish the respect for his hockey accomplishments. If anything, the story of his death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of drinking and driving, even for a hero of the sport.